Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. It's nice to meet you and to be here. So the title of my talk is Are Deep Friendships Possible Online? And I'm glad that putting the question as putting a question in the title worked to get a lot of people in the room. I'm building some suspense with a question like that. I'm going to actually keep you on the edge of your seats for a moment longer before I actually give an answer to the question before I get started. First of all, I have to thank Gabby, my former student who put me in touch with the event organizers. Thank you, Gabby. Yeah. You know what? She actually deserves more than that, I think, but that's a nice touch. And of course, I have to thank the event organizers for having me here. I think that this is going to be a very fun talk, and I'm looking forward to getting to hear what you all have to say about the subject of today's talk. I plan to speak for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully we can use the remaining time to discuss. The answer to my question in the title, Are Deep Friendships Possible Online, is no, that they're not possible online. Okay, so I'm going to be arguing that deep friendships are not possible online, and there are definitely some intellectual debts that I've got to pay here. So much of what I'm talking about is borrowed from a bunch of different philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, more recently, Dean Hawking, Steve Matthews, and certainly so many of the students I've had discussions with. As a teacher at U of T in the philosophy department, my favorite class to teach is the ethics of social media that just becomes more and more timely each time I teach the course. And in light of a lot of these discussions and the things that I've read, I'm going to be arguing that online friendships are always inferior to an in-person friendship, all else being equal. I'm sure many of you have tons of in-person friendships that are not going to be better than something you have with a person online. And there are, of course, times when you're going to want to have an online friendship. And it might, I'm not going to deny that online friendships are worth nothing or always bad. The crucial word really is about superiority, that in-person friendships are superior. I mean, if you were on some scientific mission in Antarctica, you know, the people you meet on the Minecraft subreddit are probably better than nothing, and probably be super starved for any kind of human contact if you didn't have those people. And of course, if you're, for example, a member of a persecuted minority group in a community that really doesn't like you, the people you know online might be the best thing you've got. But what I think, but even in these cases, what I think is that if you could take your online friendships and make them be in person, you would. And I think that that reflects the fact that in-person friendships are superior to online friendships. And I think that they're superior for basically two very selfish reasons. I know that it can be kind of off-putting to think about friendships in entirely selfish terms. I'm not denying that there are really, self-sacrificial parts of friendships, but I think what makes friendships good for you is also what makes them superior when they're in person. I think that one of the things that I want you to get from this talk and from the discussion we'll have afterwards is an opportunity to have thought more about what my friendships do for me. And when I think you get the answer to that question, you'll see why it's better to have in-person friendships than online friendships. Also know that in 2022, the lines are blurred between online and offline friendships. Some of you might have friends that you were neighbors with for so many years, and then they moved to Australia, and now you never see them and in person. And so that was an in-person friendship that became an online friendship. And of course, so many of us in this room probably have some experience with dating apps where we met someone online and then they became someone we know in person. So a lot of these things can change, but I'm talking about times when you have a friendship that's mostly in person or entirely in person or mostly online or entirely online. And what I mean by friendships really are those intimate relationships in which there's a deep mutual affection, a tendency or a habit that involves assisting in the welfare of the other person, and a continuing desire to engage in shared activities with that person. Especially that last one, a continuing desire to engage in shared activities. And when we understand that that's what friendships are, I think what we'll see is that I'm not just talking about the people that you know in your life whom you call friends. I'm also talking about the romantic relationships we have, the relationships we have with our parents and that our parents have with us, the relationships that siblings have and cousins have and so on. I'm talking about that one of the most important parts of being a human being, these relationships that are super intimate, affectionate, and involve engaging, in shared activities with that person. So as I said, I think there are basically two selfish reasons why in-person friendships are superior. And the first reason has to do with what I said about engaging in shared activities. I think that we often use our friendships to help us grow as people, and specifically grow in very unexpected ways. And this is much easier to do when you're in person with someone. Now, remember that I said earlier that that a part of friendship was the continuing desire to engage in shared activities with the other person. And I think that's reflected in this first reason. We often use our friendships to help create ourselves. I'll give just an example. My best friend and I, every year we go sailing. I absolutely hate building stuff. So rigging a boat, especially in the summer, would normally drive me crazy. And in fact, it does drive me crazy. Anyone here who's ever tried to rig a boat knows that it's the least fun part of sailing. But I got into it because my best friend was the person I sail with, and she really likes it. It's true, we have a sort of friendship where if I ever needed IKEA furniture built, I would ask her to do it for me, and I'd watch her do it. I guess that's another selfish reason to be in person with a friend, is they can build this sort of thing for you. But I never in a million years would have ever sailed with a person or sailed at all if it hadn't been for my best friend. As well, of course, we can come up with so many other examples. You might not be the type of person who likes ballet, but then your best friend gets you into ballet, or you get into, maybe like going to the gym together, doing something like that, an activity that you wouldn't have done if it hadn't been for your friend there to do it with. There are things that we never normally would consider doing, and that's a way in which our friendships help us grow as people in unexpected ways. And so the thought of sharing these experiences with a friend often prompts us to grow. And I think that this first reason, therefore, is really easy for us to wrap our minds around. When you're in person with someone, you can do virtually anything with them. Now, I will give technology this much. We're often very good at figuring out how to leverage existing technologies to do things with our friends. We all probably came up with fancy ways to do this during the pandemic. You and your friends might have made sourdough bread together or something. That was a thing that so many people did during the pandemic. You and your friends share photos of your starter or something and talk about them. I have to say that it's actually a really impressive fact about the way we use the internet, that we find creative ways. When you're watching a movie, you might have a stream party with a friend who lives 500 kilometers away. And so you watch a movie together, even though you're apart. You're cooking risotto, you have the other person on Zoom with you as they're also making risotto or making something else. We can use our Peloton bikes to do spinning classes with a friend who lives very far away. But what we're interested in talking about is really the possible superiority of in-person friendships. And as I've said, I think that even in these cases, we prefer to do these activities in person with our friends. And that oftentimes what these technologies are giving us is just an opportunity to do something that we wouldn't be able to do at all with our friends who live 500 kilometers away. Because if these technologies didn't exist, we wouldn't be able to even see them or hang out with them. And so I think that oftentimes what we really like about these technologies is either the novelty of them or simply the fact that without them, we wouldn't be able to do anything with our friends who live far away. I don't think that these examples really cut it, although I will give technology this much, it is very impressive that we can do all sorts of these things. Maybe 20 years in the future, when we're all in the metaverse or something, we will have a chance to like make NFTs with our friends online, and that's what we'll do. And maybe we'll have improved so much that we won't be able to say the sorts of things I'm saying now. But I do think that at least for the time being and for the foreseeable future, I think that one reason why online friendships are inferior to in-person friendships is this very thing that I'm talking about now, namely that we can use our friendships to grow as people in unexpected ways, because when you're in person with someone, you can do virtually anything with them if you want. The fact you can play a video game with someone online who lives far away, yeah, that's better than nothing. But also, if you're in person with them, you can play a video game with them next to you on the couch, and then afterwards you can get a meal together or something. And so I think that's the first reason why it's better to have an in-person friendship than an offline friendship. And I think that there's a second reason, which is actually a little harder to see and a little more subtle. And I think that this second reason is going to be the main reason why these friendships are, why in-person friendships are deeper than anything that could be possible online. And that's the fact that we often recognize that aspects of my close friends. So I often recognize aspects of my close friends that encourage me to change how I interact with them. For instance, I noticed that my friend might be anxious in closed spaces. So maybe I try to discreetly get us out of closed spaces, or I do something that will help distract from the closeness of the space. And this is what philosophers call interpretation, or interpreting my friend's behavior, my friend's character. There are things that I notice about how my friend's behaving because they're right there in front of me, and I can immediately pivot and change my own behavior to meet their needs on the spot. And this sort of thing, once I give a couple more examples, you'll understand that this is a very familiar, commonplace thing in all of our close friendships, in one form or another. This sort of interpretation, it affects how we want to spend time with our friends. It affects how we show affection. It changes how we go about promoting the well-being of our friends. Think about teasing your friend for taking a nap at 2:30 p.m. or even worse, a nap in the morning, which is the forbidden nap. You never nap before noon. And you can tease your friend about this when you see them doing this sort of pathetic thing. You recognize that your friend likes watching football, so you decide that, hey, I'm going to change how I spend time with my friend, and I'm going to offer to watch football with them. Or I know that my friend gets anxious around an ex-partner, so when I see the ex-partner at a party that we're all at, I can, dine my friend out of the party right away or something. Now, these sorts of things are, again, what we call in philosophy interpretation, and what philosophers call interpretation. Some people, I admit, do try to achieve this level of friendship online. Not everyone, of course. Some people try to deceive others, and we know we've given this the term catfishing, when you try to pretend to be someone you're not online in some really big way. But other people don't try to deceive anyone online at all. The problem, though, and what I'm going to argue this is a really, really big problem online, is that we are just afforded so many tools, and I'm thinking specifically about social media, as well as other things that you might not call social media, maybe dating apps, for example, too. The problem is that the internet gives people a huge amount of control over what other people see and over what aspects of myself I get to show online. Okay, I'll repeat that because I think that's really what this is going to come down to. The problem is that the internet gives people a huge amount of control over what other people see and over what aspects of myself that I get to show to other people. Some of the biggest, most obvious ways that this happens is that whenever we're presenting ourselves, dating app, social media, whatever, we always get a lot of time to carefully concoct answers to questions and how we respond to various prompts. I can choose to completely play down a part of myself that I don't want other people to see. I can put a positive or lighthearted spin on something, or I can completely filter out the parts of myself that I don't particularly like or want anyone to see. And even if it's not something that I don't like, maybe there's just some feature of me that I'm completely indifferent to, and so I don't bother to show it at all online. Now, I'm sure that all of you, or nearly all of you, have a pretty good sense of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that the name of the game on social media is curation, that we curate ourselves, curate how we present ourselves, and curate our profiles, our Instagram pages, our Twitter feeds, and so on. Sometimes this curation isn't even something that we shoot for. It's just something that's just a consequence of the fact that online spontaneity is completely gone, that we are never able to be our spontaneous selves because we're always responding to prompts from things. And I'm going to come back especially to the idea that it's actually impossible online later in the talk, because that's a really big thing. Towards the end, we'll get a good sense of this, that I actually think that it's just impossible to be ourselves online. It's not just, no matter how hard we try, we actually cannot be fully ourselves. And I think that the spontaneity of in-person relationships and in-person friendships is so important. And I think that spontaneity is where we're often our most authentic selves. And that spontaneity is replaced with the deliberateness of being made to think about something and think it through and type it out. When we think of our conversations with people in real life, we might think, for example, of a rapid fire, half-finished sentences, of talking over one another, a complexity of various intonations, facial gestures, bodily gestures, and so on. And all this sort of content doesn't appear at all online. And these sort of spontaneous ways of relating to people are just completely replaced by the deliberateness of virtual life. And I think that all of these features lend a kind of authenticity to in-person friendships that help reveal who you are to another person. So if I had to summarize it, I guess what I would say is that in online friendships, your friends respond to who you present yourself as, whereas in person friendships, your friends respond to who you really are. And I think that that's such an important idea, that we are most truly ourselves when we're being spontaneous and not being deliberate. There might be something nice to be said about really thinking something through and then acting, but I also think that if we reflect on our own experiences with social media, all of us, or nearly all of us, probably have the sense that see someone really, like maybe, using lighting to change photos, maybe using Photoshop on Instagram, something like that. We get the sense that this person isn't really being themselves, that who you really are, there's something fake about someone who's always, curating their lives so in order to look perfect online. And I think that it's true, it might be true to say, for example, that in-person friendships, we can be fake too. And of course that's true, but I guarantee you this, choose a close friend of yours, have a bad day, and then when your friend asks you how you're doing and you're in person with them, try to play off the fact that you're having a bad day. I bet you'll get 3 sentences before your friend catches on to the fact you're having a bad day, because it's really hard to lie about how we're feeling and who we really are to our close friends when we're in person with them. I mean, again, maybe we're not all of our friendships are so close, but your parents, I bet you, can tell when you're having a bad day and you're trying to cover it up. You can maybe say the words, "I'm okay," but everyone around you who knows you well will catch on quickly. And I think that that's completely replaced online, because when you're texting with someone and someone asks how your day going, you're like, oh, it's fine. Like, they're probably going to think, oh, they're having a fine day. But you can't pull that off so easily when you're in person with someone. And I think that reflects the fact that there's so much more to who we are than just what we say and how we present ourselves, that I can pick up right away from my friend's face or from my friend's facial bodily gestures, the way they're holding themselves, how they're really doing. And again, that's the idea of interpretation. We pick up features of our friends that they just give off, that changes how we relate to them. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, because some of you probably disagree with me. You're aware that some people online try to deceive other people. You're probably aware that some people online try to be honest and then end up curating themselves. And maybe they end up being fake, even though they're not really trying to be. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, why can't I be thoroughly upfront about myself online? Why can't I be thoroughly revealing and sincere online? Why can't I disclose who I really am to other people online? And of course, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that would be insanely tedious, but I'm a dedicated person. I've got a lot of time on my hands. I can actually type out every single thing about myself to this person I met online. I am going to do it. I'm up for the challenge. Right? You couldn't there be two people who diligently disclose everything about themselves? And maybe that starts off in some basic way where you look at what your close friendships in person are based on, what sort of information you share with your close friends, and you just start sharing that to your online friends. Right? That you just start there. You begin to build up that way, and it takes a long time, but by the end of this person knows your entire life story, and you're good, and you're going to be great friends with them. And this is what I mean when I say that I think it's actually impossible to have a close friendship online, because I don't think that this works. Even if you are super dedicated to the point of being really weird, I don't think that this works. That's because many of the important features of myself that friends in real life come to know are those things about myself that I actually have no idea about. And because these are maybe non-voluntary behaviors or things that I deceive myself about, there's no way I could ever disclose those parts of myself to friends online. And so I could actually use my in-person friendships to help discover these things about myself if I were really open-minded. But the point is that I could never report these things to other people because I don't know them myself. For instance, and I'm going to give a couple examples because I think this is such an important idea that challenges how we normally think about self-knowledge and how we think about ourselves. But maybe, for example, I'm paranoid about my personal safety. But because I think I'm just being prudent and safe, I never disclose my paranoia because I never have any way of knowing I'm paranoid. I just think I'm being safe. And most of the time, after all, when people are being paranoid, they don't know it. They just think that their thoughts and behaviors are right and justified. And our friends who see us in person, for example, and see that we might have 7 locks on our doors, they can actually tell us that we're being paranoid. But if you relied on me online and just on my reports, you just think I was some safe person who cares a lot about personal security. Another example that I think is really good and powerful is imposter syndrome. And for those of you who don't know what imposter syndrome is when you have a bunch of successes. For example, you got into a university that you really were gunning for, but then when you got the success, you felt like you didn't really deserve it. And therefore you felt like an imposter. You didn't feel like you were smart enough to get in, that you got in on an accident, that any moment someone is going to discover that I'm not as smart as I think not as smart as I might appear to be, given that I got into this university. My success isn't earned. Now, Only people who are on the edge of recovering from imposter syndrome say to themselves, I feel like an imposter because I have imposter syndrome. Most people who have imposter syndrome think to themselves, I feel like an imposter. Why? Because I am one. Because when you think about something, when you have a thought, you think that it's the right thought to have, unless you're really on the verge of getting out of that thought. Right, you could think of other mental illnesses like depression, for example. Only someone who's on the mend thinks to themselves, I have these depressed feelings because I have depression. Someone who's in the throes of depression is going to think to themselves, I have these depressed feelings because these are the right feelings to have about my life and about the world and so on. And so much of this argument that I'm making now depends on the fact that people just don't know themselves very well at all. We usually try to get self-knowledge through introspection, that process where we just sort of sit and reflect on ourselves. But I think that actually this doesn't work very well. And because it doesn't work very well, we literally can't disclose everything to people, to our online or offline friends, because we just don't know everything about ourselves. And there are mountains of psychological studies showing that people just don't know themselves well at all. Some of these studies show rather funny things, such as that people think that they're hungry when really they're thirsty, or they think that they're thirsty when really they're hungry. And I mean, we can't even make sense of like basic fundamental bodily states like that about whether you think that we're an expert. Like imagine, for example, that you tell yourself, imagine if my former student Gabby came up to me and she said, Doug, I'm really hungry. And I said, no, Gabby, trust me, you're thirsty. Like, I mean, she probably wouldn't have ever wanted to see me again after that. That would be really weird if I started correcting you about that, because we normally think that we're experts about that sort of thing. But when it's very humbling to learn that actually we don't even know ourselves well enough for that. And some other interesting psychological research shows that higher amounts of introspection are actually correlated with having less insight into yourself. That's a very curious thing, that the more you introspect, the less insight you have into yourself. The idea seems to be that because introspection results in fewer true beliefs. So you introspect and you just get false beliefs about yourself. You're just wrong about yourself. But because you introspect, you're more stubborn, so that when someone tries to correct you and tell you that you're wrong, that you actually are like some other way, you get to say, oh, don't worry, I got this. I introspect. I know myself very well. But because the process you're using, introspection, doesn't work as well as relying on someone else who's outside you telling this about yourself, you just end up being wrong and very stubborn. But rather than just citing studies like that, I think that we all know this sort of thing from our ordinary life. All of us, or most of us, probably have times when we're looking at our bodies in the mirror and we just don't think that we look very good. And then someone tells us, oh, no, don't worry, you look great. And then we reply back something like, thanks, but actually I know my body very well. It's my body after all. I know it better than you do. And that's a pretty nice slogan, but if you think about it for more than 15 seconds, you realize that it's actually the opposite of what's true. The fact that we're so close to our bodies is the reason why we can't be reliably right about them. Other people's distance from us is the very reason why we should prioritize what they have to say. Just to give an example of this, like think about a time in your life that was a couple of years ago where you didn't think you looked very good at the time. Now go back and look at a photo of yourself then, and you'll probably find that you look a lot better in the photos than you thought you did at the time, because the distance from yourself then helps you see more clearly what's true. And just think, for example, of someone who, because there's something hilarious about a kind of person who gets told by someone else that they're mean and then replies back, actually, I'm a very nice person. We think that there's something hilarious about a person who insists that they're right about being nice when other people are telling them that actually they're mean. This just isn't the sort of thing that you get to say that you're right about. And again, think, for example, of the imposter syndrome person. like that person would actually, like someone who insists that they're an imposter and is ignoring the feedback from everyone else, which might be coming in the form of successes, like getting into some university you really wanted to get into. Someone who insists that they're insists on their own narrative is like the person who's like the mean person who insists that they're nice, or the attractive person who thinks that they're unattractive, right? If we learn so much about ourselves if we prioritize what other people said about us instead of what we self-report. And our friends help us do this. Our friends can help us with this because they're not merely relying on what we have to say about ourselves, but they get to see us in the world and see how we behave and see how we interact with other people and see what we accomplish and so on. I'll give just an example from my own life. And this again connects back to the idea of interpreting and being able to respond to someone's behaviors. Earlier in my life, I was in a relationship with a woman who would get really hangry, like really, really hangry. Now, therefore, whenever this would happen, I would need to pull out a snack bar, like a candy bar or a snack for her or something. But if we asked her, because I knew that she was hangry, and that's what was happening. But if we asked her, hey, why are you grumpy? She would say, Doug, it's because of the way you're talking, the way you're walking, the way you're breathing, which was, she had it really bad, okay? She had it really bad. If we rely, why does she say this? Because that's what she honestly thinks. But I know her better than, or I knew her better than she knew herself. She thinks she's grumpy because of me. I know that actually she just needs a snack. So that's why that's an example of the way that I get to be close to someone and I get to observe them and see that, hey, it's a curious thing. I'm talking and breathing in the same way I was before you ate the candy bar, but now you're not really grumpy about it. And that's because we were in person with each other, I got to rely on something other than her self-reports. So if we were just using the data that she was presenting to me, that she honestly, sincerely believed and felt, we would have missed what was really happening. And so this connects, of course, with a point I made earlier about interpreting. We can see how our friends behave and interpret their behavior and character traits accordingly. And we can reach a deeper understanding of their behavior and their character traits, deeper than even their own self-understanding permits. Right, and I think that's what makes in-person friendships so deep. Now, the subtitle of this workshop, right, is the strength of human relationships, and I think I've clearly identified two major strengths of in-person friendships and in-person relationships, and I like that phrase, the strength of human relationships. I think that's very well put, because these strengths can't be reproduced in any other medium. So as we are, quote unquote, rebuilding together, I think that it's important to put these in-person relationships first, knowing, of course, that online friendships are better than nothing. They have their value in perhaps their own special way. But I've identified two main advantages of in-person friendships. The first is that on the one hand, they offer an opportunity for shared activities that we wouldn't otherwise engage in. And these activities help us grow as people. The second is that in-person friendships don't rely on self-reports of who we are, whereas online friendships do. And the reliance on self-reports makes it difficult for these people online to see who we really are, since they end up seeing who we present ourselves as instead, or merely who we present ourselves as. Even if we sincerely tried to disclose everything about ourselves, we couldn't because we just don't know everything about ourselves. And in fact, not only does this feature of in-person friendships lead to deeper friendships, but if we're open-minded, we can use our friends to help us learn more about ourselves. And that's another way in which this benefit is selfish, I think, that we can use our friends to learn things about ourselves. that's how many of the ancient Greek thinkers I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that's how they thought of friendship. They present our friends, for example, they depict our friends as mirrors into which we can look and learn about ourselves. And so our friends don't just give us the opportunity to grow and to improve ourselves, but they give us the opportunity to learn who we are in the first place. And when you compare that with online friendships, where there isn't really the opportunity to learn about yourself, online friendships really do look super inferior to in-person ones. Sure, they're better than nothing, but in-person friendships allow you to learn about yourself. But in online friendships, the common ground that exists between you and your friend are just those things that you must have known about yourself beforehand. Even if you try to be honest, the only things that could exist in the friendship are the things that you two are reporting about yourselves. And that each person already knows about themselves. And so I think that's the second reason why in-person friendships are superior to online ones. And that's the sense in which I would say, no, deep friendships are not possible online. That's the end of my talk. Thank you. So I'm curious whether there are any questions or anything people want to say. While I love what I have to say about the subject, I would love also to hear what you all have to say about this. Yeah, sure.
There were studies that show that introspection was further impossible stuff.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how do they measure this?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I would I don't, the short answer is I don't know off the top of my head how they measured it. Like there were a couple studies I was thinking about, and I would say like one study that comes to mind, which is a funny one, is when people were asked beforehand, do you think you'd enjoy, this is just one of many, like I had a handful when I said that. So one of the things one such study, they asked people before they got on their public transportation trip, would you enjoy talking to someone on the subway, like getting into a conversation with a stranger? And roughly 10% of people said, no, I wouldn't enjoy that. Then they got into a conversation with a stranger on the subway, and the researchers are asked afterwards, did you enjoy that experience or not? And in the study, every single person said they enjoyed talking to the stranger. The idea being that they couldn't predict that they'd actually enjoy this conversation. They were wrong about the preference that they held. That was one example of when people looked inward and looked internally and thought about what their preference was, and then afterwards it was revealed that their preference was wrong. That is just one of the studies that I had in mind. I would imagine that the other studies had a similar methodology where they got people to articulate a preference, and then they were put in a situation where their preference actually turned out to not be true. Yeah.
When you said that, I was perceiving, and you picked up the last talk with
Yeah.
psychoanalyzing myself, looking at one's childhood and saying, oh,
Yeah.
this is why I'm like this, and I have this.
Yeah.
That I might not, that people might not perceive.
Yeah.
Whereas if these studies maybe have to do with preferences.
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few different things that these studies revealed. The only ones that I can remember the exact methodology of are those that relate to preferences. I could also imagine some way you could do something similar where you show how bad or unreliable someone's memory is. Like that would be an easy thing to test as well. But I don't know off the top of my head how they tested for the studies that showed that higher introspection levels were correlated with less self-insight. I personally would, when I try to defend that part of this argument, I personally prefer to rely on the more day-to-day things, like what I mentioned about our, the imposter syndrome, the body image thing, those are the examples I would prefer to use because they're things that we're all familiar with day to day. The exact studies, I don't remember the methodologies off the top of my head, but it's certainly a worthwhile question. Yeah.
So you have been saying that it's online friendships, deep friendships are very hard or impossible to have. Would that apply to a long relationship? So your boyfriend is abroad, your boyfriend is in a different city.
Yeah.
Is that true as well?
Yeah, great. Yes, I have to repeat the question. Yeah, sorry, I forgot that for the last question. But yeah, so I'm being asked a good question about whether this is true, whether the thesis of my talk is true also in romantic relationships. I would say yes. I think that in those cases, all the same reasons I would give apply. I think that, of course, there is another component, which is the physical intimacy of in-person of like romantic relationships that's just not possible when you're long distance. And like that adds to the case, like that physical intimacy is just another part of the longing for the person to be in person with you. And I think that that's really important. And I would just say, like, always put a question to yourself. If I'm enjoying being online with this person and being long distance and being abroad, if I'm enjoying that, would I enjoy it even more if they were in person with me? Because that's, I think, the question. The question is not, could I possibly enjoy an online friendship or an online relationship with this person? Of course, sometimes we do enjoy those things, but it would be even more powerful for us to be in person with them. And that, I think, speaks to the superiority of being in person with them. Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering, you're talking about how we can't show our full selves online. It's always like people don't see our body language,
Yeah.
etc. Us that we would never notice.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about how there are different thoughts that we keep to ourselves, or
Yeah.
even people that you're closest with, you don't say everything to them, and you don't. And you talk about how introspection leads to knowing less about ourselves, it correlates to knowing less about ourselves, but we're still coming up with those thoughts ourselves, and they're still like a part of us, even if it's maybe perception is a bit different. So I was wondering if like your online self, even if it's not the same as your could it seem like we have different parts of ourselves, like we have an internal part of ourselves, all of our internal thoughts, our external part of ourselves, and then maybe even like an online, where we can think about things more and we have less spontaneity, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's going to be difficult to summarize for the people online, but that is a really deep and difficult question. But okay, so I'm being asked, and I hope that I'm doing justice to it by summarizing it, like whether there is a part of ourselves, because the personae that we create for ourselves online is still a part of who we are. Is it maybe that there's an online part of ourselves that we reveal online, and maybe in a one that we reveal in turn in person, but also the fact that we're never completely revealing about who we are, even to our in-person friends. There are things we keep to ourselves. Shouldn't that matter too? And I would say, like, I do think that there's a real place for having an online friendship. And I think your question does a really good job of getting at exactly that. For one example of this would be like, there are thoughts you have and of things you like to enjoy, but that, and I'm sure we could come up with examples if we thought about it for 30 seconds, but that if you ever express some of these preferences you have to your in-person friends, they would judge you for them. And so it's nice to actually be anonymous online, for instance, and have that freedom and distance, because you maybe this, whatever you'd say would, like, if you express it to your coworkers, they would look at you differently, or maybe if you expressed it to your romantic partner, they would run away or something like that. Like that we, in order to get free from their judgment, we actually would want to have the distance and maybe anonymity afforded by our online presence. I think that speaks to one way in which it might be valuable to have something online. But I also think that it would still be nice if we were in person with the person that we could be completely open to. That's still something we would long for. I do think as well that it is important that we all have inner private lives that we just never share with anyone. There are probably things that we would simply never tell our parents, and maybe never tell our romantic partners, never tell our siblings or even our best friend. And I mean, I think that those things just don't belong in any friendship at all. Maybe those things just actually are something you keep to yourself, and you actually get some kind of joy from having something that's secret from everyone else. But I also would say that it is extremely difficult, especially when you're getting married and you've been with someone for decades. It's probably very, very, very difficult to have any kind of truly hidden private life. While I totally get where you're coming from and asking the question, I think that we often think that because we can keep something secret for days or weeks or even years, that we could do it forever. But eventually the truth does come out. And I think it comes out in person way more easily than it comes out online. But I think you did get at some really good, important things about a distinction between in-person versus online friendships. Yeah.
I think we kind of developed the ability to also read messages or whatever, and what the other person is doing. And
Yeah.
So, yeah, it might be different, it might not be the body language.
Yeah.
And there might be times where you think it's this and not that.
Yeah.
But it was actually that.
Yeah.
But that also happens in person. So why would you that argument holds?
Yeah. So again, I think that's a really great question. For the people who are online, I'm being asked, like, you are, I get to also receive the question and then repeat it back, which is interesting and fun. So I guess if I were to summarize the question, I think that there's a great point there about how online we can interpret people's behavior similarly. A great example would be their messaging habits, their texting habits. We could learn something about whether they're a slow texter or a fast texter, or how many emojis they use. We could detect whether someone's irritable by the absence of emojis or something like that. I think that's very true. I also think that it's much easier to fake that sort of thing than it is when it's online. When it's in person. There are nervous tics and habits we have that are just impossible to fake in person because of the nature of the media, the nature of the fact that there is no medium in person. Whereas online, that stuff can be faked. Now, of course, that's not to say it is always faked. I think you can learn something about a person's mood from their texting most of the time. I mean, this wasn't an example you gave, but one really hard case to think about is just the sheer prevalence, and it increases, I'm sure, every year, and I'm sure your demographic is much more familiar with it than I am, but like people who, for example, like use FaceTime all the time with their friends. People who are stream on Twitch or something for hours and hours and hours at a time. There you're getting the body language, you're getting the facial gestures and so on, you're getting the intonation of their voice and so on. For periods of time that are so long that it's hard to fake. I remember last year in the class I was teaching on the ethics of social media, a student told me that he was living in a house with 8 other people, and they were all like FaceTiming their friends and stuff all the time. And he told me that even they would go to the bathroom with their friends on FaceTime. I do think that when you are doing stuff like that, and same goes, for example, with some of the shared activities that I mentioned earlier in the talk, like cooking risotto with your friend when you're both on Zoom together or FaceTime together. I do think that like as more and more of that technology gets invented and more widely used, you will see that the friendships you develop online will become closer and closer because they're inching closer and closer to what friendships in person are like. But I also think that like it's right now the technology is still so new that and still so imperfect that you're not getting the full experience of being in person with a friend. Because and I think all of you know this when you reflect on yourselves, being on FaceTime is better than just simply texting with your best friend who lives 500 kilometers away, but it's not the same as being in person with them. And yes, it might be good in some ways because you get to see their face and you get to hear their voice, but the fact that we all know it's imperfect reflects the fact that there's still some way to go between closing the gap between in person and online. That's how I'd reply. Other hands? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I was just thinking about because some of what you were saying now, and also earlier you mentioned briefly about like the metaverse, and I guess just like in terms of okay, when we establish we can FaceTime and etc., can still get that body language, their facial expressions, their tonal intonation, etc. But could it be perhaps that there's some like value in physical presence and physical being in person, like yeah. And we talk about in person, but like I guess like the fact of because even like looking at now this idea of the metaverse as like you know you can be present in the metaverse with your friends, for example. But is there some value in the physicality of the person that is like important?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so. It's a thing that's hard to put your finger on, if I can use a pun like that. Because oh yes, and the question, sorry to repeat it back. Yeah. Okay, so the question was about whether there's something valuable about being in literally like the physical contact with another person, the physicality of it, the in-person presence of the other person, that maybe could never be captured even as technology like the metaverse and so on really catches on and becomes even more important. I do think so. I'm sometimes, and I don't want to start backpedaling what I was saying for the past hour, but I do think that it's some of these developers who are behind this are very crafty in recognizing this stuff. So I'll give an example of something that already happens with VR headsets today. You can attend sporting matches while wearing VR headsets, and so it'll be like you're at the game, watching the game, but you aren't really there, but if you looked around in the audience, you would see other people who similarly are wearing their VR headsets at the game. And what's cool about what some of these developers have done is that they recognize that when you're in person with someone and or when you're in a crowd like this, the crowd might be really noisy, but as you get closer to the crowd, the noise level increases. And as you get further away, the noise level decreases. That's just a natural part of being in a crowded space like this. But what's cool about some of what these developers are doing is that they're building that into the experience so that as your avatar goes closer to where real people are talking among themselves with their friends in the game, you'll actually hear more of their conversation. And as you get further away, you'll hear less of it. I think it's really interesting to think about how developers recognize crucial parts of being in person and build that into their software. But I can't imagine, for example, that anything will, and I love the example from romantic relationships. Like I think that there's the fact that we long to be physically with the other person completely reflects the fact that in-person physicality is something that just is unreplaceable. Even if you can enjoy being long distance with another person, you're probably always counting down the days until you're together again. And I think that that's true of romantic relationships. I think that's really true of parent-child relationships, where some amount of touching makes a big difference. I think that that's not something that looks like it's going to be replaced anytime soon. But certainly I think that technology is going to get closer to that. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So maybe that can add on to why, that's actually a big effort
Yeah. Yeah, so the comment, which is a really good one, was about how easy it is to exit online conversations and online friendships, and the way that that contrasts with the sort of effort that we just have to put in when we're in person with someone, because we don't have the opportunity to simply leave. I think that's great. I also think that when I teach this material to students, what I often connect that insight to has to do with the strength of communities more generally, in person versus online, which is that it's super easy to ban someone from your online community because the cost of doing so is so easy. And that's one way I think people use or leverage that online technology to enforce a consensus among members of a community online. And I think that's responsible for so much spread of misinformation, which is that if someone's not towing the party line, you can just kick them out. But in person, removing someone from your community is a very difficult, fraught process, and you're much more likely to take baby steps before you take that bigger step. And I think that trickles down to our friendships as well, is that our friendships in person are stronger because the cost of leaving them is higher. The cost of starting them is also much higher. It's much harder to find a friend online, in person than online. And I think that makes a huge difference. Yeah. Eva, did I see?
Sorry. We have a question from online, can we?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Where do I see this question?
I'll ask it to you. So thank you so much for paraphrasing always the questions. It's very helpful.
I missed one. To my great shame, yeah.
No, you're doing a great job. So it's more of a practical question. Like, after spending a year and a half, 2 years, really everything mediated online, I think we can say, especially after your what you've been explaining today, that we've suffered now from not having these superior type relationships. So how do you suggest that we get back into the groove of relationships? Because we see that we're comfortable many times online, right? So any suggestions on how to go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's helpful to think about the way I define friendships in the first place as among other things, featuring a continuing desire to engage in shared activities with the other person. And I think that it's a very difficult, scary thing to just go from, like, ask yourself, oh, how do I make more friends in person? And I think that one place to begin is by asking, okay, well, what am I interested in? What sorts of things do I like to do that I can do in person? Maybe, for example, you like to hike. You could begin starting there. Begin by identifying your interest in hiking, and then maybe actually leverage some of the online resources that we've all done such a good job of looking into over the past couple of years, to find maybe a group on Facebook where you find people who like hiking, and you take those online friendships, that online membership of that community, and turn that into something that you do in person with these other people. And you can then, slowly, because it can be a long process, you begin to build out from there. You meet someone there who's really cool, and you begin to see, well, they're interested in something else. Maybe they're interested in playing badminton as well as hiking. You've never done badminton, but you met them through hiking. Now they introduce you to badminton, and you sort of build out from there. I think that it's always helpful to begin with a mutual interest. And we're also tech savvy these days that we can use some of these resources to identify those interests. I think that is a really good place to begin rebuilding together. Yeah. Yeah, if we still have, do we still have time, or Eva? We're out of time. Okay, yes, yes, yeah.
Well, yesterday, some of us were talking about languages,
Uh-huh.
you know, like quality time, physical touch.
Yeah.
Yeah, where's that coming together? So, like acts of service or whatever.
Yeah.
So, in online friendships, you can't do personal touch. So,
Yeah.
there's less and less of
Yeah.
friends. And also, acts of service, okay, well, if somebody's thirsty, I can't give her a drink of water. So,
Yeah.
there's those acts of service, you know, so.
Yeah.
Like, you can't express our love.
Yeah.
As well online. And then the other thing is also like there are some people who they spend tons of time online with their friends.
Yeah.
And then have no friends in person.
Yeah.
Any studies about how their level of happiness is?
Okay, so I'm being asked first about the love languages, that some love languages are just impossible to express online. The most obvious one being physical touch. And then I'm also being asked about people's happiness and well-being if they don't have any in-person friendships, but maybe have friendships online. I don't know the research on that second question. I would say this though, that it seems to me that you could use online friendships as a kind of training wheel, a set of training wheels, that if, for example, you have a lot of social anxiety, one really good place to begin making friends is online, and hopefully you could work your way up to having friendships in person from there. I would love to know the research on people's well-being when they don't have any in-person friendships, but my guess is that loneliness is a huge problem, and that what these people probably crave the kind of crave the sort of thing that you get from the love language, from some of the love languages, etc. I do think that it is helpful to think about love languages in this context. I don't think I'd ever heard the phrase love language as much as I did last semester when it came up repeatedly in the class I was teaching on this. Even the first time I was teaching this course, no one ever mentioned the phrase love language. But I think that there's something about it that's a really powerful way of expressing what's important, that we often want to express our love in, and there is of course the love language. You just use your words to express how you feel, but so many people want something other than that, and maybe I dare say want something more than that. And I think that the fact that we're so limited in what we could do online really reflects I mean, I don't want to come off too strong, but I would say the poverty of in-person, the poverty of online friendships. I think that we want something so much more from our friendships and our romantic relationships and so on. And the love language stuff does a good job of expressing that inferiority, I think. Do I have time for one question from Gabby? Yes, yeah.
I have a question about what you think of when people say that in-person friendships can get something draining, when you get sick of being with a person for so long,
Yeah.
that you want to like take a break from them.
Yeah.
Because like when you're separated from a friend for a while, it increases your yearning to see the friend, and in turn that might increase the quality of your friendship if you see them.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question is about like times when we are times when we maybe get burnt out, if I could use that phrase, burnt out on in-person interactions, and we need some space. And then on the other hand, times when we have is this right, Gabby? Like a longing for a person we haven't seen in a while. Yeah. So what I would like, firstly, there will be some of this that like differs from person to person. For example, I get really burnt out on texting. Like I cannot, like if someone's texting me a lot, I'm like, okay, can we have a phone call or something? Which I understand is like a generational thing that some people in this generation really don't like phone calls. And when you hear your phone ringing, you're like, you know what, I'll let it go to voicemail. But I do get what you're saying on the whole. I would say that like I think that maybe speaks to the legitimacy of a point that one of you raised earlier about how it's important for us to still have private lives that are inner, that we don't share with anyone, that we just need sometimes time by ourselves. But I also think that, and I do think maybe that's the long and short of it, is that yes, it's helpful, it's fun to see someone in person, but sometimes we just need a break. But I know from my own experience that talking to someone online can get exhausting too. It's easier to take breaks when needed. It's easier to take a 5-minute break in the middle of a texting conversation than it is to take a 5-minute break in real life. And so I think that that surely makes a difference, that when you're in person with someone, it's continuous nonstop. So you get burnt out much more easily. Like at the end of the day, maybe we just need some time to ourselves, no matter what the medium is how I would, I'd respond to that. Yeah. Cool. Well, now I'm sure we're out of time. Thanks very much. This was a lot of fun talking to you. Thank you very much.
For you.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you all. That's very nice of you. Thank you.